Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world listening to The Caring Economy. This is Toby Usnik. I am truly honored to have Sam Donaldson with us today. Sam and I became fast friends last year when we met in Mexico, and we're going to share more about that story today. But Sam is a 47-year veteran journalist, television, in particular ABC News he's identified with for decades. And I'm going to let him tell us a little bit more later in his sort of retrospective of his career, just all the awards and amazing accomplishments that he's had. But for now, I just want to simply welcome my friend and colleague, Sam Donaldson, to The Caring Economy with me, Toby Usnik. Sam, thanks for joining us.
Toby, I'm very pleased to join you. You're right, we're fast friends, and I'm sure nothing will happen during this podcast that would change that.
I hope so too, my friend. So Sam, I know you and revered you for years just as an average citizen and someone who's worked in media. And many of our listeners, because we really work with C-suite executives, mostly in publicly traded multinationals, but we also have a lot of young, aspiring journalists and people who are just starting out in their careers who might not actually, I say respectfully, know who Sam Donaldson is. So rather than having me try and digest it and do it justice, could you just give us a sort of a 3 to 5 minute overview of who you are and how you got where you are today?
Well, I'm a farm boy from New Mexico, raised on a cotton farm below Las Cruces in the southern part of the state, and born in 1934 in the middle of the Depression. Now, I don't remember it because we had enough to eat. I never knew what the Depression was like until later on. I began to study the past. So I can't say that I was deprived. World War II, of course, brought the country out of the Depression. I went on to regular schools, and I went to a military school in New Mexico Military Institute. And then I went to a small college in El Paso. It was then called Texas Western. It's now called, the University of Texas at El Paso. And what's in her name? I went into the Army, which was the thing you did in the 50s. I had an ROTC commission, and I spent 6 months originally, and then I re-upped for 2 years. So I spent that time in the Army. All the time I was in college, I worked at local radio stations. We didn't have a television station at first until the last year, and then I worked at the television station. We didn't have newsrooms in the radio stations. I ripped and read copy sometimes from the UPI wire machine, but played records. I was a disc jockey, if you will. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I mean, if you couldn't be a football hero, and believe me, I couldn't, the next best thing to enjoy life comfortably and to have associations with a lot of friends was to be a disc jockey. Finally, I went to Dallas after I got out of the Army. I was looking for a job, didn't get one when I finally ran out of money because I answered a question wrongly. A man named H.L. Hunt who was looking for someone to help ghostwrite a book that he wanted to write about politics. He was an oil man. And I was told I was the leading candidate, and could I meet him? And yes, indeed, I could clear my busy schedule and do that, and I did. And he was 70 years of age. I thought that was very old. I'm now 86, so I know that that's very young. And I went into his office when he called me in. He wore a suit from a local, and I think a national brand that you could buy. $19.95 was the most you could pay for the suit. He had his brown bag on the desk. I took it to be his lunch, although I didn't smell any food. And at that moment, H.L. Hunt was the richest person in the world. Now, he only had $3 billion, but this was 1959, and $3 billion was like Jeff Bezos. I mean, today with inflation and what have you. And he asked me some questions, and he said, "How cheap would you work?" Well, I'd never heard that. People had said, "What salary would you like?" I said, "Mr. Hunt, I'm out of the Army. I'm not married. I have very few needs at the moment. I'll work at first for whatever you think the job is worth." And on the next day, his assistant, called them secretaries in those days, called me and said, "You didn't get the job." I said, "But I was the leading candidate." She said, "Yes, but did Mr. Hunt not ask you how cheap you would work?" I said, "He did." Well, she said, "You didn't answer him. He probably would not have paid you whatever you said, but if he doesn't find a man who knows his own worth you know the rest of that story.
Mm.
So the next day I went down to the local CBS affiliate in Dallas, got a job. It had a newsroom, and I also worked news as well as the other parts of the station. But I've been in this business ever since until I retired about 7 or 8 years ago. That's my life story. And the rest of it, the time I spent in Washington, we can talk about later.
So a couple of follow-up questions on that, Sam, because this show is really focused on business and making or helping business to be more responsible. When you go back to your interview with Mr. Hunt and his great business success, what was the gist of his book? Was it meant to be varnishing his legacy? Was it meant to declare his legacy? Was it a business book? Do you recall what it was or how?
No, Mr. Hunt was very conservative. He had a 5th grade education, and he had very set ideas. Some of them may resonate with our listeners today. Yes, he wanted a book written in which he wanted to discuss politics. For instance, one of his planks in the book, which someone else eventually wrote for him, was that everyone who was eligible should vote. But if you wanted to vote more than once, you could pay money and buy more votes for yourself. Well, that was a wonderful thing for people who had $3 billion. You could buy any number of votes. I think you'd probably control the government with that. Mr. Hunt was not a liberal. Mr. Hunt did not believe, as you saw with me, that if a man doesn't know his own worth, he must not be worth much. And if he can't pull himself up by his bootstraps, well, the state and my taxes shouldn't be used to do anything for him. Mr. Hunt was somebody that today might fit in with some of the worst elements of the Trump Republican Party, yes, but not, I think a lot of Americans would agree.
Could you slot him in perhaps in a spectrum of business leaders today, where we might see a Hunt today in terms of the wealthiest, most successful business leaders?
Well, I know some of them, but not many. Mm-hmm. As a political reporter in Washington, yes, I would brush against the CEOs of our major corporations from time to time, but I can't delineate them. I can't say, well, Jack Welch, controversial now, not when he left GE, of course. He was the king of CEOs, and now, as happens in history to presidents, and I guess every one of us, people begin to revise and extend their remarks about what you were. I admired the CEOs, and still do today, who run their business ethically and legally. They're there to make a profit for their shareholders and to enlarge the company's influence. And I think that's our system. I am not against the capitalistic system as a form. I am against the excesses, and I'm against the things that capitalism can do for real people that need to be corrected. For instance, I'm for regulation, but not such regulation that the state or the regulators began to run for private businesses. Of course not. Yes. So in a nutshell, I think you kind of know where I stand. Either yes, I don't know what I stand for, or I'm right in the middle.
And I'm going to want to come back to that regulation question, particularly as it relates to social media and technology. But first, sticking with your earlier career, you started at the radio station. You were drawn to it because it wasn't an opportunity around football for you. But was there a business? Were you drawn to the business of radio per se, or was it just more sheer luck that you ended up there?
Well, I'm sure I was drawn to radio because it was fun, and you could hear yourself in the sense that hey, you were somebody. I had the normal impulses to want to succeed at something, and I want people to say, oh, yes, we know Sam, and we like him or we don't like him, but it was something I did for myself, yes, to begin with. When I got into the news business much later, I began to develop I think the ethics of the news business that say we were not there to serve ourselves. We were there to serve our audiences and the public for several reasons. One being to hold a job, obviously, to elongate the influence of our company, ABC News I worked for, but also to inform people and to bring them facts that were, we thought, actual facts. Mm-hmm. And if we discovered the next day that we misled the audience because it wasn't a fact, we'd correct it.
Great. And there also, I want to come back because ABC News, owned by the Walt Disney Company, there's a lot of big business in that sector and in that company. But before we talk about that, I just want to again stick with the youth piece a little bit. Tell me about military school and both how it shaped you and what merit or opportunities there might be for young people today who are considering either education in a military school or young families thinking about it, or just military service in general. It sounds like.
Well, I could recommend it for men and women, young men, young women. When I went to New Mexico Military Institute, only men. If you were caught with a woman in your room, you were expelled. Mm-hmm. Today, they are the cadet colonels, meaning the top people, which is a good thing, obviously. But what happened to me was not only interesting, but it was very, very salutary for the rest of my life. The first year, I went there when I was 14 years of age. That was when I could go as a sophomore in high school. Mm-hmm. And in the first year, I was known as a rat. That was all the plebes, if you will, all the first year young men were called rats. And we were at the disposal of the old cadets. And I mean, punishment was administered with rifle butts on the butt, with a paddle on the butt. The worst thing on the butt was believe it or not, a toothbrush, a very limp, or rather stiff toothbrush on the back of it. You pulled it back and boom, it popped. Now you say, well, you're talking about not just physical hazing, you're talking about the kind of assaults that today would be recognized as assaults. Yes, I know, but I didn't know that. I played the game in the sense that I had no choice. But I think I was the saddest rat in my first year, meaning I got more demerits. I walked more tours around the quadrangle with my rifle on weekends, while other cadets got passes to go down to a movie theater. And I amassed a terrible record. But something happened over the summer, and I can't explain it. An epiphany. I said, maybe it's better to be with the winners than the losers. Mm. So I came back and I shined my brass and I made the formations on time. My clothes were immaculate. My room could pass a white glove inspection on the weekends. And I was promoted at the end of the year, one of about 16 or 17 from the class to the most senior position for the next year, which was sergeant. Now I'm going to have to cough here. I'm sorry.
God bless you.
I assure you, as far as I know, that was a normal cough and not the dread virus. But in any event, whatever caused me, and I can't think of a thing except I just sort of figured out, I didn't like being the saddest rat. I didn't like having all these tours. I didn't like knowing that I was not going to be promoted. That it helped me for the rest of my life to understand that you want to be with the winners rather than the losers. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about winners who do it ethically and do it legally and do it without hurting other people, but simply through their ambition and their hard work, they move forward.
Hear, hear. So you finish school and then you go off to Dallas in media, and then while you were working across the station, it seems that there was some kind of innate calling to get into the news side of the operation. Is that?
Yes, it had a news department, but people who did reporting also did the rest of the stuff, read commercials and what have you. It was the transition phase, where in El Paso, there was no such thing as local news departments in radio or then the television station. In Dallas, yes, there were news departments in the two or three top stations, but they weren't exclusive and they weren't the kind of news department you think of today. So I got to do both and enjoyed both in a sense, but I decided I'd leave and I resigned. And the manager said after a year, he said, "Why are you resigning? You don't like it here?" I said, "No, I do like it here. We haven't been, you've been very fine to me. Well, you want a raise, that's what you want." "Well, no, Mr. Rembrandt," that was his name. "I'm going to New York." And the only thing that saved me from the kind of speech that I would not want to remember, the one that would say, "I'm going to New York, Mr. Rembrandt, to be a star." I didn't say to be a star. Now, by this time, it was the news business I was interested in. So I packed everything I had in my car. I went to New York, found a place in Queens, a hotel to spend the night in, and tried to find news work. And I failed completely. I went to all the networks. I went to the local stations. They all rejected me. You don't have the kind of experience. I mean, you seem like a nice guy. You look like you're clean cut, but you can speak the English language to an extent. But the man at NBC, I remember distinctly, because he said, well, Mr. Donaldson, we usually require 5 years of print experience from anyone we hire. We'll make an exception and make it 3 years if we find something from somebody that we think is exceptional. Mm-hmm. But in your case, you don't have any print experience. And I said, well, that's true, but give me some copy, ask me to write a radio report on what those stories say, and let me show you what I can do. Well, he said, it would be a waste of your time, and he meant his time. Mm-hmm. Well, that's okay. I failed miserably to get a job, and I was running out of money, and I had applied in Washington, and they called me from WTOP, the CBS affiliate in Washington, and said, you have announcing experience here. Yes, I do, from college. He said, well, we're looking for a summer relief announcer. You know, we let our regular announcers have their vacations. Would you like to audition? We'll have an open audition on the 13th of February, whatever it was. So I said, yes, I think I would like to, and I did. And there were 5 of us, all males, young, fairly young men. And we watched each other as we, in front of a camera, told the story of our life, and we answered questions, and we read a commercial and this, that, and the other. I thought it was pretty good, but there was one guy that was really terrific. I mean, you could see he had something between his ears rather than sawdust. He had a great voice. When he ad-libbed the story of his life, it was like it had been magically written by Hemingway. So I thought, he's got it. And when it was over, finally the news director came in and said, well, you've been, all of you, very good, but we've selected Sam Donaldson to be our summer relief announcer. And a year later, I discovered why. The man who ran the station for the Washington Post Company told his number 2 the night before, I feel I'm coming down with a cold. I'm going to stay home tomorrow. There's nothing going on. You take care of that audition. But he felt better the next day. And Mr. Hayes came in, and he watched the auditions, and he's looking through the resumes that we'd provided. And he comes to Donaldson, and Donaldson was in the Army. Well, John Hayes had been in the Army in World War II. He was in London. We said, yeah, just take this guy. I'm sure he thought the man that I spoke of, who was really good, was better than I was from the technical standpoint, but he liked it.
That's amazing.
I tell you this story because every step of the way in my career, the old adage that it's better to be lucky than smart applied to me. I got the kind of breaks that some of them I earned, but some of them I was just lucky. I was in the right place, or somebody said you'd been in the Army, and everybody needs that. You can't depend on it, but if you just wait a while, you'll get some.
Correct, or try again. I have a colleague, Sally Sussman, who's been on here before, and we talk about that old saying that the harder you work, the luckier you get.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're with Sam Donaldson, the 47-year veteran of ABC News, who's been a leader, particularly in public affairs and political journalism. Sam, we just left off at you're joining basically a part of the Washington Post company, right?
Yes, as a summer relief announcer at the CBS station, which they owned. And I played records and I did things, but they sent me out to the transmitter to do an all-night program called the All Night Satellite. There had been a very popular program at many stations, sponsored by American Airlines, called Music Till Dawn. Mm-hmm. And Texaco wanted to get in on the act, and so I was there. And during the night, I was by myself. Who was listening? Played records in the sense that there was an engineer who did that.
Mhm.
I also read some news, and I also commented on the news. And so I would comment quite frequently on what was happening. The Soviet Union has just exploded a 50 megaton device, the largest known. I mean, talk about Hiroshima, nothing
Mhm.
compared to that. And I deplored it, and I talked about the arms control. And the station manager was listening, the man who had hired me.
Yes.
And I'd applied for the news department, but of course it wasn't available. But a man named Roger Mudd, who's now retired, he was a great CBS correspondent, had been the station's principal anchor in the news department, and CBS hired him right from that spot that summer, and the spot was open. And I said I wanted it, and the station manager said, you can have it if you want it, but you'll have to take a pay cut. I had been making $150 a week as a summer relief announcer, and he said, I can pay you $125. And I said, okay, and it worked out.
Amazing. So you filled his shoes, Roger Mudd's.
I did. Well, Roger, I have great respect for Roger. So to say I filled his shoes would be an overstatement, I think. But I think at least I had my own, that we could walk in tandem later in life.
So we're really getting into the sort of the fast growth trajectory in your career, I think. So take us to, I think perhaps, Sam, your first political campaign that you either commented on or followed, or is there something between that and this position?
Oh, we're still working for WTOP, the local station in Washington. But in those days, people, even in a sophisticated place like Washington, didn't make a lot of distinction about what was the network what was the local station. I mean, Walter Cronkite, they knew, was a network anchor, pardon me, but they'd hear me, and they thought Walter and I worked together.
Mm-hmm.
So I got to be known in Washington, and I got to know the politicians, and I got to know President Kennedy, in the sense that I'd go down to the White House and watch him in the Rose Garden and attend 2 or 3 of his question and answer periods, his news conferences. We never had the courage to try to ask a question. I mean, the big boys and girls, May Craig and Sarah McClendon, women were beginning to be factors, but minor factors in this business. But it was just an exciting time for me, an exciting time for anyone young in Washington, and to be able to watch the Senate. Now, you asked about the first campaign. While working for that station, the station decided, because everyone thought it might be the same thing as a network, to send a reporter to the Republican convention and to the Democratic convention that year, 1964, we're talking about. And I was selected to go to the Republican convention. And so I got to study Barry Goldwater. And when he won the nomination, as was expected, then I was assigned to cover his campaign on the bus. Wow. Here from a local station. I was mingling, and in those days, the campaigns were all set for the print reporters, their deadlines, the early morning editions. Yes, radio and television had become a factor, but it was not yet the major behemoth factor that it is, of course, today. But that was quite exciting to be on the bus. Sometimes we would have to bunch up if they hadn't the number of rooms at a hotel. That's right. And so there were 2 of us, always were the last ones. And I remember at the Brown Palace in Denver, we had to be roommates, and I liked the guy. I guess he kind of liked me. At the end of the campaign, Barry Goldwater lost big time, as expected. That night in Phoenix, in Arizona, where we were, my buddy and I, and one other guy that we knew, who was also at the end of the reporter chain, were having drinks and talking, and we told each other how we had voted. And it's the only time in my life that I've told other people how I vote, including people I've been very close to, although if you're close to me, you kind of know how I feel. Yes. You probably know already what I'll do without telling you this November. One of that my buddy, though, he left the news business, that he wasn't doing that well in it, He's Californian. He hooked up with a California politician. And in 1981, he came to Washington with that politician, Ronald Reagan.
Wow.
And he told everyone, you know, Donaldson voted for Barry Goldwater. Well, at first I was most chagrined at all of this because by that time I was known as someone probably who wouldn't have voted for Barry Goldwater, but I did.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, it did me great stead with the conservatives, the Republicans. Well, he may not be as bad as we thought. After all, he voted for Barry.
So can you give us this is a big question, but when you think about back then, riding the campaign bus, the state of media, particularly in campaigns focused on print journalism, and you think about today, we've just gone through our first digital conventions, and we've covered a lot as a nation in the past 4 decades. What is the state of play for media, particularly those who are covering campaigns? Is it completely different? Are there practices that are now acceptable that weren't? Has print been eclipsed by cable? Those kinds of things. There's some things that have held true throughout those 4 decades, and then, or 6 decades almost now. And what has been incredibly transformed or obliterated?
Well, there are a couple of things. Every advancement or change that I experienced in the time I was doing the news on radio and particularly television was preceded by a change in the technology, technical ability.
Yes.
I'll bring you just very quickly, the internet, the rise of cable, the ability of people to do what you and I are doing today through Zoom rather than using the telephone, and eventually became the iPhone. For years when I worked in Washington, after leaving the small radio station WTOP and joining ABC Network, which was third, at that time, one of our anchors, a man who I revere, the late Frank Reynolds, used to say, if you get on the FBI 10 most wanted list, the best place to hide would be the anchor of the ABC evening news, because CBS and NBC were so dominant. But I don't regret going to ABC because it worked out for me too. But you had 3 networks, and people listened if they were interested in the news, and they believed, to the extent that you could make them understand that you were doing your best to be factual, that they were getting straight material. And again, you corrected it. Today, as you can see, for many reasons, people don't believe that. Many people don't believe that. Many of the voters this November do not believe what I think to be the facts based on science, based on observation, based on interviews that you've recorded and you can play back. We now have a president, for instance, who denies saying things knowing that we have the videotape and the audio tape of him saying them. He just says, no, it's fake news. And his adherents say, yeah, right. Oh my goodness, the news business. I don't know quite how to overcome that, except to say to young journalism students, just keep doing your job of trying to bring facts and information that you believe to be correct. You believe it to be correct for reasons other than your prejudices or the fact that your ignorance gets in the way of it because you've checked it out. Just keep doing it. I think eventually people will, the majority will, want that kind of reporting and pay attention to it. But we're in a transitional phase here, a phase of flux that's very dangerous.
Well, let me probe there a little bit, Sam. I, as you know from our time together, we both, full disclosure, did our volunteering on the Bloomberg network, or Bloomberg campaign rather. I am very concerned about the size of social media and its clout, particularly Facebook. And there's I think a very good documentary that just come out called The Social Dilemma, which is about this very matter. You'd spoken earlier about Mr. Hunt and big business and concentration of power. What say you about the role of social media, which is, I believe, incorrectly not regulated in the same way as a media company? and has disproportionate power and influence over things such as our elections and even our purchasing.
Well, I agree. Something has to be done. I'm not quite certain what. On the one side, we have those of us who are the First Amendment adherents. And I mean, there are exceptions, obviously. There have to be. But the idea that a company that deals in speech, deals in ideas that others come, and it's the transmission belt for those ideas, should be in its own right making decisions about what ideas are acceptable, what ideas are okay. Well, yes, if you give me the power, if I become king for the day, I will use my own view of what's okay. And I think I have to be very liberal about allowing you to speak. But of course, if you want to provoke a riot, if you want to provoke a sedition, if you want to cause my young child to commit suicide because of your tone, I mean, I can go down the whole list of reasons why I should keep you from doing that. It's the problem of deciding. Look at the political campaigns we've been going through recently, in particular the ones going through at the moment. Even Zuckerberg has decided to do something about Facebook, something about ads. The president must have been amazed when a video of his recently was tagged and warned the people who saw it, and I don't remember the exact words of the warning, but warned to say, watch out, this isn't true.
Yes.
Well, yeah. So the problem becomes what to do about it, meaning who gets to decide if someone is going to decide or some group going to decide what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and how does that fit the tradition of our country? Never mind the Constitution, and I say that admiring of the Constitution, but people who fall back on, oh, my freedom is to not wear a mask. Well, yes, but your freedom doesn't extend to making certain that I'm going to die because you don't wear a mask. Come on, guy. There was the great Justice Learned Hand. Judge Hand never was on the Supreme Court. He should have been, who said, you have the right to swing your fist as far as you want, right up to the tip of my nose. So these people who say, I'm not going to wear a mask, that's not the manly thing to do. And besides, my hero doesn't wear a mask. These people are menaces. I mean, I don't know what to say to you. Does it fall under negligent homicide if they kill me?
And they have a platform that is not, in my view, treated the same way as a traditional media company. So they're not liable for their actions and words. And I think if they were treated in that same way, we might actually be able to calm things down a bit and have more civil discourse than echo chambers.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I don't think that the media, still controlled to some extent by the FCC, would be allowed to falsely propagate the idea that those 22 kids who were killed in Connecticut weren't killed, and they weren't kids, they were government plants.
Yes.
Oh, well, or the Holocaust. I think all my life after World War II, there were ways for me to see if I wanted to see or read if I wanted to read. In fact, that the Holocaust didn't exist. It was all a fabrication. I once went to Argentina, and on the way down to Bariloche, I stopped in Buenos Aires and met a man named Wilfred Offen. I knew him. When I say met him, it wasn't just casually on the street. I knew who he was, and I went and said, could I talk to you? And he said, yes. He was a lieutenant in the SS at the last days in Berlin, and he was Joseph Goebbels' press guy. And he said, well, Joseph Goebbels was the propagandist for Adolf Hitler. That's true, but he had his own press guy, was Wilfred Offen. So what Wilfred Offen was doing at the time I met him in 1994 in Buenos Aires was publishing anti-Semitic, or rather Semitic literature, including tracts about how the Holocaust didn't exist. And he was reaching people who wanted to read that. But he certainly wasn't reaching a mass audience, for instance, of young people who maybe had no recollection, certainly, and maybe no background in what the Holocaust was. And hey, if you read his tract, he's got a point. Well, he doesn't have a point. I know I've gone on too long about these things, but I don't know exactly how, other than some obvious cases, that we're going to be able to regulate all of the false material that now permeates social media, put there by people on one hand who mean to do it because they know it's false and they want to cause public opinion to change, or by ignorant people. Mm-hmm. Ignorant not meant in a dismissive way of that person, but they just don't know what they're doing. They actually think what they're putting on, what they say, is okay and correct when it's absolutely not.
Well,
so what do you do? What do you do, Toby? What's your answer?
Well, I like what you said to your peers, your fellow journalists, by saying, keep on doing what you're doing, right? Stay grounded in good practical journalism and do your job. I also think that films like this, Social Dilemma, will help parents in particular who are raising preteen and teenage kids about social media, and think twice about what they're exposing their kids to and how they're exposed to it. And then I think the election will be formative, no matter how it plays out. I think our biggest challenge is how are we going to knit this nation back together, no matter which side of the aisle someone sits on. But I think everyone is quite weary right now, and that will hopefully be an inflection point where we can start to gradually, perhaps, start to knit back the nation, and as you suggest, start to deal with these endless volumes of documents and misinformation. But before we shift off of that, Sam, I just want to ask, given your tremendous background in covering international affairs, China, Russia, Cold War, US, superpowers, all of that where we are today, what's your sort of gut or your informed view about the role of Russia and or China and other nations in our social media and the manipulation? I mean, we hear about it. We have investigations going on in Congress, but it seems to be to no end. Would you?
Well, I can only trust I can trust our intelligence agencies. I think I can still do that. And they are unanimous in having said that in 2016, Russia actively worked to try to help Donald J. Trump to be elected. And they worked across social media, and they worked in ways which at that time I hadn't even heard of. There's now saying, and we have the new directors of intelligence, DNI, who replaced Senator Coates, who testified the other day that they're doing it again, both China and Iran, but mainly Russia, to try, and in the case of Russia, to try to reelect Donald J. Trump. Mm-hmm. And now we get reporting from the White House, that the White House press room, that Trump wants to fire the man because, of course, it doesn't mix with what he wants. I mean, right. I trust these people. I don't have my own Central Intelligence Agency. I believe them, and I believe what I see in the world to be the case. We're under attack from so many ways that when I was working in Washington weren't available. And we've got to do something about it. Yes. But if we have a president who's trying to do everything possible to see that we don't do anything about it, draw your own conclusions as to his motives.
Yes. Well, I know for you, it's not your first rodeo. And I think that what we're seeing is what you've seen throughout your career, whether it was, the missile crisis with Cuba back in the 60s to Vietnam. There's just a constant battle of ideologies and power, and we'll see our way through it. But in a certain sense, I would think that in some ways it's no different than it's ever been. We just are being a little bit less transparent about who's doing what or to what ends.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, we like to think, and I think it's true, in my lifetime certainly is true, we're at the most dangerous part or point of trying to maintain our republic, our democratic republic that we ever had, except for the Civil War, which was overcome with a lot of deaths and firepower. Mm-hmm. I think we'll overcome this too, because I have faith that the majority of the American people, despite all of the barrage of misinformation that we all receive, the ways that we now have to communicate with people who don't mean us good, but mean us ill. The majority of the American people still have the kind of ethics and kind of morality, if you will, whether it's based on religion or whether it's based on their view of life, that will see us through. Now, if I'm wrong, well, where do you want to go? New Zealand?
We're still.
You want to go to Canada? You want to go to Uruguay?
They won't allow us in. Well, so Sam, I think the answer, to go back to your earlier question to me, part of the answer and the biggest piece is leadership, right? And we know that with good, responsible, ethical leadership, we have a better chance of moving through these obstacles or moments and taking others with us versus leaving folks behind. Talk a little bit about presidents in particular, but any leaders that you've covered through the years and sort of, it's a rather trite corporate expression, but best in class. Where have you seen best in class? You've shared so many tales with me about, sitting down with Miss Lillian when you're covering Jimmy Carter, or with your tales just now about the Reagan administration, and with Bush, you've got so many different leaders that you have followed. Are there a few examples that just left you sort of inspired and thinking, yeah, this can help get us through our darkest days?
Well, leaving the current president out of it, the presidents that I've seen and I've known particularly and covered particularly, all had strengths and weaknesses. You would love to have a person being president of the United States, man or woman, who combines the ability to inspire people, to bring them forward, to be a leader who can engender followers by the very example, and also who knows the world, who knows how to solve problems. It goes on the whole list. I don't have to go through it. Would be well, I haven't seen one yet who's that perfect. So let me take Ronald Reagan, for instance. He was, from the standpoint of inspiring the country, for good or ill, and I think basically for good, although I disagreed with many of his domestic policies particularly, it doesn't get any better than that. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, knew how to press the flesh, when I covered him, I would watch him in a room of people who you could tell maybe half of them didn't like him when he walked in the room. And when he left, they said, well, what a guy, I'm a beekeeper. He said, what do you do? And then he said he kept bees, and when he was 9 years old, and some of them died because of a fungus. And I told him what the fungus was. And I noticed one of his aides said, Mr. President, in the next room, they're waiting for, for the 5,000 people. I'm talking to Bill here. That was him.
Yeah.
So he had that quality. Jimmy Carter was an engineer. And if we had wanted just someone to solve a problem by coming up with a right solution, and never mind the small talk and all of that, he helped engineer and deserves, and finally got a Nobel Prize, but not for what he should have gotten at the time, the first peace treaty between an Arab nation, the one that counted, Egypt and Israel. Yes. He did it. I watched it. I mean, I was there. I wasn't in the rooms at Camp David. I wasn't in the rooms when he went to the Middle East to save the treaty, and he did it. But you'd want that kind of guy in emergencies. Nixon would have gone down, despite his faults and despite his personality, as a really good president, if it hadn't been for that one felony that he decided to commit because of his feeling that enemies were all around him and he had to get them before they got him. EPA, that was him. The Environment Protection Agency was Richard Nixon. He did many other things that Democrats today, they sort of think they did it. He did it. He brought us into the idea that the 1.3 billion people out there on the map that we didn't recognize, China, Red China, was a country, and we had to do business with it. John Kennedy, of course, we all, at our generation, I don't care whether I voted for Goldwater or not, it wasn't Kennedy running in '64. I probably would have certainly voted for him.
What about
he brought us?
I'm sorry.
LBJ?
Yeah, in terms of
let's talk about
Vietnam
LBJ.
And Great Society, but please go ahead. I'm sorry.
LBJ is coming. The historians have a way of doing this. For instance, someone that I admired at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, when he left, was Uncle Fudd, and as far as history went, he was okay, but we had two little recessions and Now the historians are beginning to understand that working with the Democrats in Congress, Johnson, who was the majority leader in the Senate, and Sam Rayburn, they did the highway program that linked the nation for the first time, that made sense and made great transportation possible. And in foreign policy, I didn't have to fight. I was in the service when they came to him. Well, I wasn't in the service, but I would have had to fight. When they came to him and they said, we have to save the French, sir. And the Yum Yum Valley of Vietnam, this young General Giap, 26 years of age, he's got the French at Dien Bien Phu under siege. And if they lose that post, they're going to lose their ability to get back their colony. Mm-hmm. Well, like I said, no. And Admiral Radford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this is on the record, this is not me telling a tale, said, sir, it's getting so late, we may have to use the atomic weapon to stop this communists there. And Ike said, no, I mean, the days of empire are over. The French are not going to get back. Those people do not belong to them. They're Vietnamese. They belong to their country. And besides, I've discovered over the years that people who've been in the military and have seen and known that people die are loath to send in the boys and now the girls. Hey, let's show them this touch of steel. Let's show them the flag. They can't do this to us. Well, maybe they can do it to us. General Giap did it to us in Vietnam. He was now not 26, but he figured out how to keep us from being able to expel the communists that were infiltrating South Vietnam. I know I've gone again much too long, Toby, but when you get me started, what's your name, sir? I'll tell you for an hour what it is.
Please go on. No, I just wanted to know, so LBJ, and I also want to talk about Obama briefly. But
yeah, let's talk about LBJ. I haven't talked about it. I talked about myself.
Yeah, because he was doing the Great Society as well as Vietnam at the same time. Some say that those two things were too much for any administration. But what do you think about his legacy as a leader?
Well, it's being revived. I think always, it's like Nixon. No matter what revision comes for Nixon, the first line will be the first, and I trust the only president to resign his office one step ahead of the sheriff. Mm-hmm. LBJ's will be Vietnam. Mm-hmm. But right behind, he clearly, never mind what Donald J. Trump says about himself, he has been the best president for civil rights change in the right direction.
Yes.
Since Abraham Lincoln.
Yes.
The best. I mean, you can't, not just Thurgood Marshall in the Supreme Court. Here was a man in Congress who voted against every civil rights bill that came before it, including one that would stop lynching, because he thought he couldn't, and he was right, get reelected. Once he was elected, and once he became president, rather, now the real Lyndon Johnson came out. He was going to get that civil rights bill in 1964 through. I covered that debate, and I covered the key vote, which was not the final passage of the bill. It was breaking the Southern filibuster. It took 67 votes in those days, not 60 as it does today. And Lyndon Johnson knew how to twist arms, to threaten, to promise. He got Everett Dirksen, the minority leader, to bring the Republicans, or many of them, along. And one of Everett's rewards not only was posting one of his people of every trade commission or every commission in Washington, was to give the final speech before the vote to break the filibuster. And Dirksen quoted Victor Hugo, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And it was Lyndon Johnson who did it. In the Voting Rights Act, he did. Right. And yes, if it hadn't been for Vietnam, and I'm not excusing his actions there from the standpoint of a policy that he pursued that led to disaster, if it hadn't been for Vietnam, he would have gotten that great society to the point where I would not have eliminated all poverty in this country, but boy, would it have helped.
So, ladies and gentlemen.
And here is a man, you never would have thought this.
Ladies and gentlemen, again, we're with Sam Donaldson, the 47-year veteran of ABC News and a friend and fellow campaign volunteer with me from earlier this year. Sam, I want to stick with race relations now, since we talked about Johnson and his efforts. And this might segue into a conversation on President Obama, as well as Trump, on race relations. But in a summer where we've just seen the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the greater and greater emphasis appropriately, I think, on Black Lives Matter. A lot of the business leaders that I've been interviewing have really, in my estimation, concrete, actionable responses to this that really try and address systemic racism, and are the first to admit, the real leaders, the ones I truly respect, to say they don't have all the answers, but they're really taking the deeper look at their audiences, their stakeholders, and how they can be part of improving on this. What is your sense of the past 40 years and the state of race relations and where we go from here? I mean, what beacons do you see and what traps do you see?
Well, the first, in my working lifetime, certainly, the first major advance came about in the early 60s when young Black men sat down at lunch counters, and when they're told to leave, they weren't allowed to do that, stayed. Mm-hmm. And the peaceful protests, and Martin Luther King Jr., one of the great people like Mahatma Gandhi and others who have done things through peaceful resistance rather than taking a gun and trying to shoot people, moved us forward. I was there at his great speech at the Lincoln Memorial in August of '63. He did it in a way that we could talk later about, if there's time, about what makes a successful politician in our country today with the media and all of that. Mm-hmm. He did it by force of his moral arguments, certainly, but he did it by his presentation, that voice. You can hear it now, that ringing voice from the mountains of, if you are simply someone with great ideas, and I was once told that Albert Einstein, who I never met, was someone that you wouldn't invite, to a dinner party to be the life of the party. He just didn't have a lot to say outside of E equals MC squared and relativity. Yes. You invited him because he was a genius. Well, to be a successful politician today, it's not enough to have good ideas, to be able really to put them, if you elect me, to put them into practice, but I can't get elected because I don't turn you on. I mean, there's something about me that is off-putting. So there's a great push in the early 60s, which resulted in the Civil Rights Bill of '64 and the Voting Rights Act, with the Earl Warren Court doing it and enforcing it. And then we went into a sort of a period where everyone talked, not everyone, but people talked the good talk and they wanted to do it. Mm-hmm. But nothing was done from the standpoint of correcting other ills or giving the kind of impetus to society that would now move us forward. Yes. For instance, George Floyd, what was that like? Well, how many other Black men and women had been shot by police or killed by police in circumstances that we now see were wrong, even though many of them had been excused? But it was like a tsunami. I've never been in a tsunami, but it rippled across the ocean. And as it ripples across the ocean, if you're sitting there in the ocean, it doesn't mean it. But if you're on the shore and all of a sudden, this wall of water hits the shore, you're through. And when George Floyd was murdered, suddenly all of these injustices became so prominent, and the people who complained about them and took to the streets to complain about them became now heroes to so many people rather than thugs or protesters who had to be put down as rioters. Mm-hmm. And the president tries that, but it's not working. I mean, we'll see in November completely, but it just doesn't seem to be working, thank goodness. I think we're at another Renaissance period. I'm not predicting that at the end of this period, hey, everyone's going to be equal. It doesn't matter, as Martin says, the color of your skin. It's the content of your character will decide who gets to the starting line first to get into the race. But we'll make another big step forward.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, again, we're with Sam Donaldson, veteran ABC News journalist. Sam, I like that metaphor of the wave going across the ocean. I think another part of what made it so profound and why this time hopefully is different is that it resonated globally with so many people who had been the other, or the ones who had been unheard or had not been able to share the mistreatment they had been through. So while it sounded like a local story here, I think it really had universal reverberations. So I like that metaphor that you used, going through the ocean.
Well, you talk about universal reverberations. I think one of the things that will restore us in the world, from the standpoint of our prestige and our ability to work with other nations, is when other nations see that we do come through something like this and we come out on the other side better for it.
Mm-hmm.
Let me give you a statistic
Please.
that is frightening to some people. I'm from Scotland, I think. I haven't done the DNA test. I have a little Uganda in me, but who knows? Of the 8 billion people in the world, 11.1% are white. Now, you're not going to build a wall around a white Christian country and hold out the rest of the world. It's suicide for your grandchildren. No, we must engage again. I tell, if a young parent came to me right now and said, oh, I have this young child, and the languages. And I said, well, first you teach them English in this country, then you teach them Spanish, then you teach them Mandarin Chinese. We have to engage with these other countries. The idea when Admiral Radford could say we could drop the A-bomb and stop the dirty commies in Vietnam is over. Yeah. We are the most powerful military nation, we think, in the world, although the Chinese are building nuclear submarines with missiles every bit as powerful as ours. And they're turning the army, which has always been a defensive army, the People's Liberation Army, into an aggressive army. And they're building little islands in the South China Sea and say, this is our land. What do you mean it's your land?
Yes.
It's hundreds of miles from your land. I say it's my land. Oh.
Well, Sam, you and I are like-minded in that sense. As I would characterize it as internationalists. I've lived and worked and studied my whole life globally, and many of the listeners of the Caring Economy are in multinational organizations. The idea of putting up walls or keeping things out is, I think, absurd. It is a global economy. We have truly mixed people. The Chinese diaspora alone, I think there are about 300,000 mainland Chinese students in the United States each year pursuing education. They contribute quite a bit financially and economically, as well as intellectually, I think, to this country. So the idea that by banning WeChat and TikTok this weekend, as the president has tried to do, is, I think, short-term, perhaps doable, but long-term, to your point, it's not going to get us and our youth where we need to be in the 21st century. To the contrary, we need to be out in the world and engaged. I also think, when I asked you about your service earlier, that's part of the answer for the way forward. I'd love your reaction to this, but I think about President Kennedy and the Peace Corps. I think there's a way to introduce a national service in this country. You don't have to be military service. It could be other kinds of service, but to go out into the world and meet the other and engage with the other face to face for a sustained period of time, I think is a huge opportunity for us to get our young people out and better, just as I know the military did for you, or my living and working and study abroad has done for me. What do you think of that?
No, without knowing it, long before we met, we had the same idea, and we weren't alone in that.
Yeah,
we want universal draft, if you will, of young people who are physically able, obviously, to do it, and they can go into a military service, or they can go into a number of organizations like the Peace Corps, but the Peace Corps is only one, in which they then perform work for people here at home and the rest of the world. And the reason is, of course, twofold. They do perform work. They help us out. But they get to meet people who don't look like them, who don't worship like them. And when you're young, You can break free of what great-great-great-great-granddaddy did, and it came down generation by generation as the way to live.
Mhm.
And I'm not just talking about the South. I'm talking about any sets of prejudices that we all have, and that we all may or may not have passed on to us by our parents and our grandparents. They're free of that. If you're in a college dorm, for instance, today, arguing about, well, is there a God really? You may turn out that after all these arguments to say, yes, I was brought up in a religious atmosphere in which said there was a God and I believe in. Or you may turn out and say, well, no, I think maybe I want to explore a different path. But at least you have learned something, and you have tested your prejudices against others' ideas.
Correct.
And that's what these organizations would do.
Yes. Amen. Well, I'm going to let that be our final Q&A, but Sam, you have the last word. Please, ladies and gentlemen, Sam Donaldson, the epic journalist, ABC career news veteran and friend of mine. Sam, you and Sandy have been such a great addition to Harlan's My Life this year. What about a final word from you? What words of inspiration might you want to leave with the Caring Economy listeners?
Well, I think this election is very important. And if it's the most important in my lifetime, but if it's the most important in the life of the country since the Civil War, then it is. I believe it's going to come out all right. I believe if all the votes that are cast are fairly counted, and that the effort to suppress voting is kept to a minimum, and I wish it were kept to zero, that we will now be on a path to return to the values of this country, to return to the country that works with other nations in harmony. And yes, we want to keep our economy strong, we want to keep our military strong, but that does not mean that we withdraw from the world, which we have been doing for the last 4 years. We must re-enter organizations like the Paris Peace Organization. We must re-enter the Trade Association in the Pacific, which now Xi Jinping runs rather than the US side. We must do that. I think we will. And I'll just say this, if I'm wrong, don't give up. Amen. If Donald J. Trump is reelected, we just simply have to fight harder. It's like the Supreme Court. Yes, he's going to be able to fill, unless the creek rises, the seat to make it 6-3. Because I've been counting on John Roberts to save us, as he has from saving the Affordable Care Act twice and other things. But he can't save us now if it's 6-3. But that doesn't matter. Eventually, we'll have a Supreme Court. Do we pack it? I don't know. Roosevelt tried and it didn't work out for him. But we'll do something. So don't give up if the November election returns Trump to the White House. Just fight harder.
Yes, and vote on November 3rd. Sam Donaldson, thank you so much. Please give Sandy my best, and please come back to the Caring Economy soon. All the best.